My sister called me a failure at our parents' anniversary. Then the lawyer read Dad's real will. The banquet hall at the Wilshire Country Club smelled like white lilies and my mother's perfume, the same bottle of Chanel No. 5 she'd worn since I was 6 years old. 40 years of marriage deserved exactly this kind of room. Crystal chandeliers, round tables draped in ivory linen, a string quartet tuning up in the corner, while waiters slid between guests with trays of champagne. I stood near the gift table in a navy dress I'd bought on sale, clutching a card I'd spent 3 nights writing and rewriting, trying to find words big enough for 40 years of 2 people staying together. My name is Reagan Hale. I was 34 years old, and I had exactly $412 in my checking account, a studio apartment above a laundromat, and a job managing inventory at a hardware store that I was, if I'm honest, quietly proud of. My sister Whitney arrived fashionably late, the way she always did, in a cream silk jumpsuit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She swept in trailing her husband Preston, a private equity guy with a jaw like a Ken doll, and a laugh that filled rooms whether anyone had said anything funny. Whitney had always known how to make an entrance. I had spent my whole life learning how to make an exit before anyone noticed I was uncomfortable. "Reagan!" Whitney air-kissed both my cheeks, her bracelets clinking. "You look so comfortable." She said it the way you'd compliment someone's practical shoes. "Did you get that dress at the Nordstrom rack sale? I saw the exact one online." "Probably," I said. "It was on sale, so." So resourceful. She smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes, the way it never had since we were kids fighting over the good half of the bunk bed. Our parents, Richard and Carol Hale, sat at the head table looking exactly like what 40 years does to 2 people who chose each other and meant it. Dad had a new hip and a hearing aid he pretended not to need. Mom had silver hair she refused to dye, and a laugh you could hear across a parking lot. They built Hale & Sons Hardware from a single storefront in 1986 into 6 locations across the county, a business Dad still ran, mostly, though these days I did more of the actual running than anyone at that party would have guessed. Nobody there knew that. That was the whole problem, in hindsight. Dinner passed in the ordinary choreography of family events. Cousins comparing kids' soccer schedules, an uncle asking if the chicken was dry, someone's toddler shrieking with joy under a table, then the MC, a family friend named Gary who'd officiated my parents' wedding, tapped a fork against his glass. "Time for toasts," he announced, and the room quieted into that expectant hush. Whitney stood first. Of course she did. She'd clearly prepared this, note cards tucked into her clutch, though she pretended to speak off the cuff. "Mom, Dad," she began, voice already catching with practiced emotion. 40 years. I look at you 2 and I think, that's what it looks like to actually build something, to actually succeed at what you set out to do." Warm laughter, warm applause. She talked about Dad's grit founding the business with nothing but a second mortgage and a dream, about Mom raising 2 daughters while keeping the books. She talked about her own life, her house in Brentwood, Preston's fund closing a new round, their daughter Sloane's acceptance to a private school with a wait list longer than the Declaration of Independence. She was, in other words, delivering a toast to our parents that was mostly about herself, but she did it with such warmth that nobody seemed to mind. That was Whitney's gift. She could make self-promotion sound like generosity. And then she turned, glass raised, and looked at me. "And Reagan," she said, smiling that smile, "you know, not everyone gets to build an empire. Some of us just get to be supportive, right? Some of us are the quiet ones, the ones who show up. That counts too." A ripple of laughter went through the tables, the kind of laughter that isn't cruel on its own, but becomes cruel in context, in tone, in the small pause she left before adding, "I mean, we can't all be failures at some things, and successes at others. Some of us just pick one lane and stay in it." She raised her glass higher, toward our parents, to Mom and Dad, the real success story in this family. The room laughed again, warmer this time, not realizing, or not caring, that the joke had a body count of 1, and it was me. I felt my face go hot. I looked at my hands. I looked at the card I still hadn't given anyone, the one that said 40 years of showing up for each other is the only definition of success I've ever needed. I thought about putting it back in my purse and slipping out to the parking lot to cry in my car like I had at every family event since I was 19 years old, and dropped out of college to help Dad when the business nearly went under during the '08 crash. Nobody at that party knew about that year. Nobody knew that when Hale & Sons was 3 weeks from bankruptcy, I was the one who sat at the kitchen table with Dad until 2 in the morning, restructuring vendor contracts, cold calling suppliers for extensions, working the floor of the flagship store for minimum wage because we couldn't afford anyone else. Whitney was in her sophomore year at USC, majoring in communications, posting photos from spring break in Cabo. Nobody blamed her for that. She was young. She had a life to live. I never asked her to feel guilty about it, and I never told anyone what those years actually cost me, because Dad had asked me, quietly, in that careful way of his, not to make Whitney feel bad about it. She has her own path, he used to say. You have yours. I hadn't realized, until that exact moment at that anniversary dinner, how thoroughly my path had been erased from the family story. Not by accident, by my own silence mostly, but erased all the same. I stood up before I'd decided to. My chair scraped against the parquet floor, loud enough that heads turned. Actually, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, I think I'm going to skip my toast. Congratulations, Mom and Dad. I love you both very much. And I sat back down, because I would not cry in front of that room, and because there was nothing I could say that would land the way I needed it to land. Not there, not then. Whitney sat down too, satisfied, sipping her champagne like she'd won something. Preston squeezed her shoulder. Somewhere behind me, someone's aunt whispered, "Well, that was awkward." And I understood she meant me, not Whitney. Dad didn't say anything, but I saw him watching me across the room, his jaw tight, his eyes doing that thing they did when he was filing something away. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought it was just embarrassment, secondhand humiliation on my behalf. I didn't know then that it was something else entirely. I didn't know that 3 days later, my father would sit in a lawyer's office and change his will. I didn't know that 6 weeks after that, he would be dead of a heart attack in the stockroom of the flagship store, found by an employee at 6:40 in the morning, and that the next time our whole family gathered in a room together, it would be for his funeral, and 2 weeks after that, for the reading of a will that would blow our family apart and put it back together in a completely different shape. To understand what happened in that lawyer's office, you have to understand what happened in the 15 years before it, because the story Whitney told at that anniversary dinner, the empire builder and the quiet supportive one, was a story built entirely on what people could see. And what people could see was never the whole truth. After the '08 crash, I didn't go back to college. I told myself I would, eventually, once the business stabilized. But stabilizing a hardware chain that had been over-leveraged by an ambitious expansion into 3 new locations right before a recession is not a 6-month project. It became my life. I learned inventory management from a guy named Elmer, who'd worked the flagship store since 1991. I learned vendor negotiation by making every mistake a person can make and then not making them twice. I learned payroll, insurance compliance, and eventually, quietly, how to read a balance sheet better than my father did, because Dad was a builder, not a numbers man, and somebody in that family needed to be both. By the time I was 26, I was effectively running operations for 4 of the 6 stores, though my title on paper was inventory manager, a title Dad and I had agreed on years earlier because, as he put it, if people knew how much you actually do, they'd expect you to want the title that comes with it, and I'm not ready to give that up yet. I never fully understood what he meant by that until later. At the time, I took it as pragmatic. Dad wasn't ready to retire, and giving me an official title felt, to him, like an admission that he was stepping back. I let it go. I told myself the title didn't matter, that the work mattered, that Dad knew what I contributed even if the org chart didn't reflect it. Whitney's path looked different from the outside, and it was different, but not in the ways people assumed. She graduated from USC, took a job in marketing at a tech startup that folded within 2 years, married Preston, and became, this is not an insult, it's just true, extremely good at presenting a certain kind of life. She hosted dinner parties with place cards. She posted family photos with captions about gratitude and abundance. She talked often about building something real with Preston's fund, though as far as I could tell, her actual involvement in his work was decorative. Company events, client dinners, the occasional Instagram post tagging his firm. I don't say this to diminish her. Building a life around hosting and presentation and relationship management is a real skill, and some marriages and some families run on exactly that kind of social capital. But it is different from running 4 hardware stores' back-office operations for a decade, while your father slowly, gradually, without either of you quite naming it, comes to depend on you completely. Here's the part that matters most. Dad knew. He knew everything. He knew I'd given up my education for the business. He knew Whitney's version of success was mostly performance. He knew, because I never told him otherwise, that I resented none of it, or told myself I didn't, because I loved him, and because the business was, in some strange way, the longest conversation I ever got to have with him. We talked more in supply closets and stockrooms than we ever did at family dinners. He'd ask me what I thought about a new supplier, and I'd tell him, and he'd nod slowly and say, "Good, that's what I thought too," even when it clearly wasn't what he'd thought at all, because he'd changed his mind based on what I said and didn't want to make a ceremony out of it. That was Dad. Undemonstrative. Steady. A man who showed love through trust rather than words. 2 years before the anniversary party, Dad had a health scare. Nothing dramatic. A fainting spell in the parking lot of the Riverside location that turned out to be a minor arrhythmia, and it rattled him more than he let on. He started talking, obliquely, about when I'm not around, and eventually, and someday you'll have to decide. I assumed he meant someday, in the vague, unspecified future adults use to avoid thinking about mortality. He meant considerably sooner than that. About 4 months before the anniversary party, Dad asked me to meet him for coffee, not at the store, not at the house, but at a diner 2 towns over, where nobody would recognize us. That should have been my first clue that something unusual was happening. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to actually think about it before you answer, not just tell me what you think I want to hear." "Okay. If something happened to me," he said, "if I dropped dead tomorrow, could you run this whole thing?" Not 4 stores. All 6. Everything. Payroll, expansion, the works. "Yes," I said, without hesitation, because it was true, and because some part of me had been running it in my head for years already, imagining the decisions I'd make differently if I had the authority to make them. He nodded slowly. "I thought so." Then, "Your sister thinks she could too." I didn't say anything to that. There was nothing kind to say, and nothing honest that wasn't also unkind, so I said nothing, and Dad, being Dad, understood the silence perfectly. "I need to think about some things," he said. "I'll let you know." I didn't know what he meant. I assumed it was about succession planning, something abstract and administrative. I had no idea he'd already started meeting with a lawyer named Arthur Bellwether, a man I'd never heard of, to quietly rewrite the entire architecture of what would happen to Hale & Sons and to the rest of what my father owned after he was gone. I had no idea, that is, until 3 days after that anniversary party, when Whitney's toast finally gave him the last piece of information he needed. I found out what happened in those 3 days much later, pieced together from things Arthur Bellwether told me, and things my mother eventually admitted, tearfully, months after the funeral, when the anger between Whitney and me had cooled just enough for anyone to talk honestly. The Monday after the anniversary party, Dad called Arthur Bellwether's office and moved up an appointment that had been scheduled for the following month. He drove there alone, which Mom said was unusual. Dad hated driving into the city, hated parking downtown, always found excuses to put off appointments that required it. He didn't put this one off. According to Arthur, Dad sat down, still visibly rattled from the weekend, and said, "I need to finish what we started. Today, if we can." They had, apparently, already drafted a will months earlier that split the estate close to evenly between Whitney and me, with some additional provisions for mom's care and a modest split for a cousin who'd worked at the Fresno location for a decade. That earlier draft reflected a father trying to be fair in the blandest, safest sense of the word. Equal on paper, regardless of what either daughter had actually contributed. Dad told Arthur that weekend that equal isn't the same as fair, and I've been avoiding that difference because I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But somebody's feelings are going to get hurt no matter what I do, so I might as well do the honest thing. He told Arthur about the toast. Not in detail. Dad wasn't a man given to dramatic retellings, but enough. Arthur told me later that my father said one thing that stuck with him. My daughter stood up in front of 40 people and called her sister a failure, and the sister just sat there and took it, because she spent her whole life taking things quietly, so nobody else has to feel bad. And I realized I've been letting that happen for 15 years. I built that behavior into her by never correcting it. Whatever guilt or clarity moved through my father that weekend, it moved fast, and it moved decisively. Over the following 2 weeks, in 3 more appointments with Arthur Bellwether, my father restructured his entire estate. He did not tell me. He did not tell Mom the specifics, though she knew changes were being made. Dad had told her only that he was finally getting things sorted properly. The kind of vague statement married couples of 40 years learn to let pass without interrogation, especially about paperwork neither of them enjoyed discussing. He certainly did not tell Whitney. 6 weeks after the anniversary party, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my father went into the flagship store before opening, as he did most mornings, to do inventory counts on the loading dock himself, a habit he'd never fully given up even after I took over that function years earlier. An employee named Denise found him at 6:40 a.m. on the floor of the stockroom and called 911 and did CPR until the paramedics arrived, but it was already too late. The coroner said it would have been fast, at least, a massive cardiac event, nothing prolonged. I was the one who had to identify him at the hospital because Mom couldn't make her legs work when the call came, and Whitney was 90 minutes away in Brentwood, and by the time she arrived, someone had to have already done the parts nobody wants to do. I don't remember much of the next 2 weeks. Funeral arrangements happen in a fog, I've since learned. A fog everyone who's lost a parent recognizes, and nobody can quite describe to the people who haven't lived it. I remember picking a casket. I remember Whitney crying beautifully at the funeral, dressed immaculately, delivering another toast, a eulogy this time, about what an inspiration our father had been, about the empire he built, about legacy. I remember standing at the graveside thinking, he knew everything about both of us, and now he's the only person who did, and he's gone. I was wrong about that last part. He'd left something behind that knew it too. Arthur Bellwether's office was on the 9th floor of a mid-century building downtown, the kind with brass elevator doors and a lobby that smelled like old marble and floor polish. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mom, Whitney, Preston, and I sat in a conference room with a long walnut table and a view of the parking structure across the street. Whitney had insisted Preston attend, for support, though everyone in the room understood he was there because he wanted to know exactly what his wife stood to inherit. Arthur was a small, precise man in his 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered a great many difficult conversations and learned that rushing them never helped. He had a folder in front of him, thicker than I expected, and a second folder beside it that he didn't open right away. "Before I begin," he said, "I want to say that your father was extremely deliberate about this document. He revised it recently, and he was very clear-eyed and very specific about his intentions. I know some of what I'm about to read may be surprising. I'd ask that everyone let me finish reading before responding, and then we can discuss." Whitney shifted in her chair, glancing at Preston. I felt my stomach tighten, though I told myself it was just grief, just the strangeness of hearing my father's intentions read aloud by a stranger in a room that smelled like leather and printer toner. Arthur began with the standard provisions. Funeral wishes already carried out, a modest bequest to Denise, the employee who'd found him, for her decade of loyal service, and for being there for me at the end, when my family could not be. That line made Mom start crying quietly into a tissue. Then provisions for the family home, left jointly and unconditionally to Mom, along with a trust structured to cover her living expenses and care for the rest of her life, administered independently, so she'd never have to ask either daughter for money. Nobody had a problem with any of that. It was, if anything, exactly what we all expected. Then Arthur turned a page, and his tone shifted slightly, the way a doctor's does right before delivering results. Now, as to the disposition of Hale & Sons hardware and the remainder of the estate, he said, your father's instructions are quite specific, and I'll read them largely in his own words, as he asked me to. He cleared his throat and read, "To my daughter Whitney, you have always been the daughter I was proudest to introduce to people. You are warm, you are social, you built a beautiful life, and you gave me a granddaughter I adore. I want you to know that none of what follows is about how much I love you, because I love you exactly as much as I love your sister, and I always will. But love and inheritance are not obligated to be the same shape, and for years I confused generosity with fairness, and I let that confusion protect a version of our family that wasn't entirely honest. You once told me, when you were 22, that you didn't want to work in the store, that it wasn't your path, and I respected that, and I still do. Nobody should have to build their life around a hardware store if it isn't in them. But somewhere in the years since, a story took hold in this family that you were the successful one, and your sister was somehow behind, and I let that story stand because it was easier than correcting it at every Thanksgiving dinner. I am sorry for that. It was my failure, not yours, and definitely not Reagan's. I am leaving you the sum of $400,000 outright, along with the vacation property in Big Bear, which I know you and Preston have always loved, and where I hope Sloan makes many happy memories. I am not leaving you any ownership stake in Hale & Sons hardware, because you have never asked to be part of it, never worked inside it, and would not, I think, want the responsibility that comes with owning it, the 14-hour days, the payroll stress, the vendor negotiations at midnight. That is not a punishment. It is, I hope, a kindness, built on actually knowing what you want out of life, rather than what looks good at a party. The room had gone very still. Whitney's face had drained of color. Preston had stopped moving entirely, his jaw doing a small, involuntary twitch. Arthur continued, unhurried, turning to the next page. To my daughter Reagan, I am going to say some things here that I should have said to your face years ago, and I am sorry that a piece of paper has to say them instead. You gave up your education at 19 years old to save this business, and you never once asked me for credit, a title, or a raise commensurate with what you actually did. I let that go on far longer than I should have, partly because the business needed you too much to risk you asking for something I might have had to say no to, and partly, I think, because some part of me assumed you'd always just be there, the way the sun comes up. That was selfish of me, and unfair to you, and I want you to know I understood, even if I never said it, exactly how much of what this company became was built by your hands and not mine. 6 weeks ago, at my own anniversary party, I watched your sister call you a failure in front of 40 people, and I watched you sit down and take it, quietly, the way you have taken nearly everything quietly for 15 years. I want to be honest, my first reaction was anger at Whitney. But my second more uncomfortable reaction, over the following days, was anger at myself, because I built the conditions that made that moment possible. I let you be invisible. I let your sacrifice go uncelebrated, because celebrating it would have required admitting how much I depended on you and how little I'd given you in return. So here is what I am doing, and I hope you understand it is not sudden or thoughtless, even though I know it will feel that way. I am leaving you 100% ownership of Hale & Sons hardware, all 6 locations, all associated real estate, all accounts and assets of the business, outright, with no conditions except one, that you finally take the title that should have been yours years ago. You have been the president of this company in every way that matters since you were 26 years old. It is time the paperwork said so too. I am also leaving you the remainder of my personal investment accounts, roughly $2.1 million as of this writing, because you spent 15 years building something instead of building yourself a nest egg, and it's time somebody built one for you. I love you both. I am sorry it took me dying to say the things I should have said while I was living. Take care of your mother. Take care of each other. if you can find a way back to that. And Reagan, stop apologizing for taking up space. You earned every inch of it. Arthur set down the pages. The room was silent except for the tick of the wall clock and Mom's quiet, steady crying, which had shifted somewhere in the reading, from grief to something more like relief, like a held breath finally let go. Whitney spoke first, her voice thin and strange. That can't be the whole will. Big Bear and $400,000? The business is worth... Preston, what's the business worth? Preston, to his credit, said nothing. He knew exactly what it was worth. Somewhere between $8 and $11 million, all told, depending on how you valued the real estate. It's the complete document, Arthur said gently. Notarized, witnessed, entirely valid. Your father was of sound mind when he signed it. I can attest to that personally. And there's a physician's letter in the file confirming it as well, which he requested specifically, anticipating that this might be contested. He anticipated I'd contest it, Whitney said, and something in her voice cracked. Not quite grief, not quite fury, something in between. He wanted to be thorough, Arthur said. He said, and I'm quoting him now, I don't want either of my daughters spending money fighting each other in court over money I earned. If Whitney wants to challenge this, that's her right, but I want the record airtight so it doesn't drag on for years and eat everything up in legal fees. I sat there, frozen, unable to process the actual scale of what had just been read aloud. A business. My business, now, apparently. $2 million. A title. 15 years of invisible work, suddenly, retroactively visible, written down in my father's own words, and read aloud in a room with my sister's face collapsing in real time across the table from me. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a moment of vindication, of sweet justice, of the humble sister finally getting her due, while the golden child gets what she deserves. And there was some of that in it, I won't pretend otherwise. But mostly what I felt, sitting in that conference room, was a grief so specific it had no name. Grief for every year I hadn't been seen. Grief that my father had needed to die to finally say it. Grief that the moment I'd waited 15 years for had finally come, and the person I most wanted to celebrate it with wasn't there to see my reaction. This isn't fair, Whitney said, standing up so abruptly her chair rocked back against the wall. He can't do this. I'm his daughter too. You are, Arthur said, with the calm patience of a man who had clearly had this exact conversation with other families many times before. And he left you a significant sum and a property worth close to $1 million. That is not nothing, Whitney. But he was very clear that ownership of the business was not something he wanted to split, and specifically not something he wanted to give to someone who had never worked inside it. I could have worked there. Nobody ever asked me to. He said you told him at 22 that it wasn't your path, Arthur said, checking his notes. Those were his words, not mine. Whitney turned to me, and for a moment I saw something in her face I hadn't seen since we were children. Not calculation, not performance, just raw, unguarded hurt. Did you know about this? No, I said, and my voice came out rough. Whitney, I swear to you, I had no idea. I found out sitting right here, same as you. She studied my face for a long moment, and I think some part of her believed me, because the anger in her eyes shifted, just slightly, towards something more like despair. He never even told you, she said quietly. He just did this, to both of us, without warning either of us. I think, Mom said suddenly, in a voice that hadn't spoken since the reading began, that's exactly why he did it that way. Because if he'd told either of you beforehand, you'd have spent whatever time he had left arguing about it instead of just being his daughters. She wiped her eyes. He was a coward about a lot of things, your father, emotional things, but he was never a coward about the truth once he decided to say it. Whitney didn't speak to me for 11 weeks after that day. She hired a lawyer of her own within a month. Not Arthur, obviously, but a contentious estate attorney named Marcus Voss who specialized, according to his website, in protecting families from unjust disinheritance. She filed a formal contest of the will, alleging undue influence, though it took her lawyer exactly one meeting with Arthur's documentation, the physician's letter, the multiple witness drafting sessions spread across weeks, the complete absence of me from any of those meetings, to advise her, privately, that she had almost no chance of prevailing and would likely just burn through the $400,000 in legal fees trying. She dropped the contest 6 weeks later. She never told me this directly. I heard it from Mom, who heard it from Arthur. Those 11 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. I was, on paper, suddenly wealthy, the owner of a business worth 8 figures, sitting on $2 million in investment accounts I hadn't touched because the number felt unreal, like something that belonged to a different Reagan than the one who'd been counting quarters for laundry money 3 months earlier. I moved out of the studio above the laundromat, eventually, into a modest 2-bedroom closer to the flagship store, though I want to be clear I didn't go buy a mansion or a sports car. I think some part of me was afraid to spend the money, like spending it would somehow prove Whitney's old accusation right, that success meant excess, that being taken seriously meant performing wealth the way she always had. Instead, I did the thing my father had asked, the one condition attached to the whole inheritance. I took the title, President and CEO of Hale & Sons Hardware, printed on a business card for the first time in my life at 34 years old, after 15 years of doing the job without the name. I called an all-staff meeting at the flagship store, stood in front of employees who'd known me for a decade as the inventory girl, and told them, honestly, that nothing about how the company ran was going to change, because I'd already been running it, they just hadn't known it. A few people laughed, not unkindly. Denise, the employee who'd found my father that morning, hugged me afterward and said, "About damn time they put your name on the door, honey." I expanded the business modestly over the following year, a 7th location, in a town 2 counties over where a competitor had gone under, and I hired an actual operations manager to take some of the load off me, someone to be for me what I'd been for my father, except with a proper title and a proper salary from day one. I made sure of that specifically. I didn't want anyone working under me the way I'd worked under him, invisible and unpaid in every currency except love. The hardest conversation of those months wasn't with Whitney. It was with my mother, about 6 weeks after the reading, when she finally told me the thing she'd been carrying since before the funeral. "He asked me," she said, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cold cups of tea between us, "whether he was being too harsh. The week before he changed it, officially. He came to me and said, 'Am I punishing Whitney? Tell me honestly.' And I told him no. I told him he was finally telling the truth about something he'd been lying about for 15 years. Not lying to other people, but lying to himself, about what he owed each of you." She looked at me, her eyes wet. "I should have said something sooner too, Reagan. I saw it all those years. The way you disappeared into that business, and nobody clapped for it. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in how your father structured things. I regret that. I regret staying quiet as much as I regret anything in my whole life." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held her hand across the table, the way I'd held it at the funeral, the way I imagine I'll hold it again someday, when it's her time, because that's what showing up quietly for people actually means, and I'd apparently been fluent in that language my whole life, without anyone telling me it counted as a kind of success, too. Whitney called me on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, almost 3 months after the reading. I almost didn't pick up, old habit, bracing for another fight, but something made me answer. "Can we get coffee?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like a statement she wasn't sure how to end. We met at a place halfway between our 2 lives, a coffee shop with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, the kind of place Whitney would normally have called cute, in a tone that meant she'd never actually come back. She looked different, thinner around the face, tired in a way I'd never seen on her before. The performance dialed down to almost nothing. "I've been in therapy," she said, before I'd even sat down fully. "Since August. Preston suggested it, actually, which, I know, surprising." "That's good," I said carefully, because I genuinely didn't know what kind of conversation this was going to be. "I want to say some things, and I need you to let me get through all of them before you respond, because if you interrupt me, I'm going to lose my nerve." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. "I've spent my whole life needing to be the one who looked successful. I don't fully know why. I think it started because you were smart in this quiet, effortless way when we were kids. You'd read a book and just know things, and I had to work for every A I ever got. And somewhere along the way, I decided the only way I could compete with you was to make sure everyone was looking at me instead of comparing us directly. And it worked. For a long time, I built a whole life around making sure people were looking at me. She took a breath. And then Dad's toast, my toast, at his anniversary. I've replayed that 1,000 times, Reagan. I told myself for years that you'd chosen a smaller life, that you liked the quiet, unambitious version of things, because that story let me feel okay about how much bigger and shinier mine looked. I never let myself actually ask what you were doing with your days, because some part of me was afraid of the answer. And the answer turned out to be that you were running an entire company while I was hosting dinner parties and calling it building something. Whitney, let me finish, please. Her voice wavered. I contested the will because I was furious and grieving, and because losing felt like proof that I'd been wrong about everything my whole life, and I wasn't ready to sit with that. My lawyer told me I had almost no case, and some small, honest part of me already knew that before he said it, because deep down I knew Dad wasn't wrong about any of it. I knew you'd earned every bit of what he left you. I just couldn't say that out loud yet, because saying it meant admitting what I'd done to you at that party, in front of everyone, was exactly as cruel as it felt in the moment, and I'd spent months telling myself it was just a joke that got a little out of hand. She finally looked up at me, eyes wet. I'm sorry, Reagan. Not the kind of sorry where I need you to immediately forgive me and tell me it's fine. I know it's not fine. I know I don't get to fast forward through you being hurt just because I finally said the words. I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it. What you actually did for this family, and how long I let myself not see it because seeing it was inconvenient for the story I needed to tell about myself. I sat with that for a long moment, turning my own cup slowly on the table between us. 15 years is a long time to carry an invisibility you told yourself you didn't mind. I thought about telling her it was fine, the way I'd always smoothed things over, the way I'd sat down quietly at that anniversary dinner instead of saying what I actually felt. I decided, for maybe the first time in my life, not to do that. It's not fine, I said. You're right about that. It hurt for a really long time, Whitney, and it hurt in ways I don't think I even let myself admit until Dad's will said it out loud for me. Because apparently I needed a dead man's paperwork to believe my own life counted. My voice cracked slightly, and I let it. But I don't want to spend whatever time we have left being at war over something Dad already settled. He didn't do that to punish you. He did it because he ran out of time to fix it any other way. And I think if we spend the rest of our lives finishing the fight for him, that's its own kind of tragedy. Whitney reached across the table and took my hand, the way she hadn't since we were kids, before whatever competition had grown up between us learned to speak louder than whatever love had been there first. I'd like to try, she said, slowly, if you'll let me. Slowly, I agreed. I can do slowly. A year after the reading, Hale & Sons Hardware opened its 7th location, and I stood at the ribbon cutting in a suit I'd bought myself. Not on sale, not apologizing for the cost, with a title on my business card that finally matched the work my hands had been doing since I was 19 years old. Mom was there, healthier than she'd been in months, having found her own footing in a grief support group she credited with saving her sanity. Denise brought a sheet cake from the local bakery, the good one, the one Dad used to order for every store opening, and I understood that as its own kind of tribute, a small continuity between what he built and what I was still building. Whitney came too, with Sloane, who cut the ribbon with a giant pair of ceremonial scissors and squealed with delight when everyone clapped. Whitney and I weren't fully repaired. I don't think grief and betrayal heal on a schedule, and I don't think either of us expected them to, but we were talking most weeks now, real conversations, not performances. She'd started, tentatively, volunteering at the Big Bear Properties local community center, something she said made her feel useful in a way hosting dinner parties never quite had. I don't know if that will turn into something lasting. I know she's trying, in whatever way she's currently capable of trying, and I've decided that has to be enough for now, because demanding more than someone can currently give rarely produces the thing you're hoping for. Standing at that ribbon cutting, Watching Sloane run through the aisles of the new store shrieking about the paint chip samples, I thought about my father's letter, the one Arthur had read aloud in that conference room. Stop apologizing for taking up space. You earned every inch of it. I'd spent 15 years believing that being useful and being visible were opposite things, that you could have one or the other, but asking for both made you greedy, made you difficult, made you the kind of daughter who caused friction at family dinners. My father's real will, in the end, wasn't really about money. It was the first time in either of our lives that he'd said, plainly and on the record, that the quiet years counted exactly as much as the loud ones, maybe more. I still keep his letter in the top drawer of my desk at the flagship store, folded into the same creases Arthur handed it to me in, worn soft now at the edges from how many times I've read it on hard days. Some mornings before the store opens, I sit in the stockroom where Denise found him, the same stockroom where I do my own inventory counts now, a habit I didn't consciously decide to inherit, but apparently did anyway, and I let myself feel the whole complicated weight of it. Grief, gratitude, anger that never fully goes away and doesn't need to, and underneath all of it, something that finally, at 35 years old, felt something like peace. My sister called me a failure at our parents' anniversary party, in front of 40 people who laughed along without knowing any better. She wasn't entirely wrong to think that's how it looked from the outside. A woman in a discount dress with no title, no property, no impressive husband, quietly refilling shelves at a hardware store, while her sister built a shinier life around her. But my father knew what the outside never showed. And in the end, he made sure the whole family found out too. Not through a speech, not through an argument, but through the plainest, most permanent language he had left. The truth, written down, read aloud, and impossible to take back. It turns out some inheritances aren't about the money at all. Some of them are just somebody, finally, telling you they saw you the whole time.